Hello, computer science students, and welcome back. This is video 2 in our inheritance series, and we're going to talk about, in video 1 we talked about kind of a weird thing that happened where we could pass a frame object and a window object into a method that took container objects, and it was fine, and it ran, and it printed them. They're printing out their debug statements for each variable, which is not normal, right? Normal behavior would be this isn't a container, so we cannot print it. It's right, it is not a container, we cannot print it. So this line 47, and line 50, based on our knowledge so far, should have been errors. And so we're going to do a couple more examples about weirdness that can happen, and we'll explain why it's happening. So the next weirdness that can happen, we can make an array list that holds containers, and we can add the container object we created up above to it. It seems normal. But we can also add the frame object and the window object that we created up above. So we have an array list of containers, and it holds a container, a frame, and a window. So that's weird. Again, same issue. We have this thing, in this case an array list, that's expected to hold containers, but it holds containers and other stuff. So that's weird. And then in segment 3, it gets even a little bit crazier. We loop through the containers array, right, which now contains a container, a frame, and a window. And we create a variable called container, a variable that holds containers or points to containers called container. And we assign it to containers.getI. So we get 0, then 1, then 2. We get the container, the frame, and the window. We store them all in a container variable. Each loop through, we update the container variable with a new value, and we print it. And if we look at our segment 3 printout, it prints out fine. It prints our container, it prints our frame, it prints our window, all with their default values. Well, that is really strange, right? And so the reason for this, the reason we can do this is because of the idea of inheritance. So in Java, we have relationships between classes, inheritance relationships. And sorry, I'm gonna talk about this while I go to this link. So docs.oracle.com/frame. You could also just Google Java frame class, and you'd find this. So this is the API for the frame class. So what is inheritance, and what does it mean, and what does it let us do? All right, well, if we look at the frame class, we're going to spend some time at the very top. In our other API examples, we haven't looked at this at all. Now we're going to spend some time looking at it. So our frame class has a relationship, and if you look, there's window and there's container in this relationship. So this relationship is important, and this is what allows us to pass a window or a window or a frame as a container. So when we have things that look for containers, we can pass a window in, we can pass a frame in. It's because of this hierarchy. So this is a relationship between classes. And if we look all the way at the top, there's a class called the object class, which is a little bit of a misnomer. The object class is a class, not an object. So a little unfortunate there, but it is a superclass, is what it's called, to a lot of other classes. In fact, every class that you create yourself is by default a subclass of object. Object is a superclass to your class. So this relationship of superclass subclass is represented here. Object is a superclass to component. Component is a subclass to object. And what this translates to, like by sort of getting the feel for it, the high level understanding of what this translates to, is you can think of every component is an object, or is a relationship. Every component is an object. Not every object is a component. So it's kind of similar to something like every square, and this is supposed to be a square, so bear with me here. Every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square, right? So that relationship, rectangles and squares, similar to the relationships here, every component is an object, not every object is a component. Every frame is a window, not every window is a frame. Every window is a container, not every container is a window, right? So the way that we've designed this, we had a method and an array list and a variable that point to or hold or use containers. But every window is a container, and every frame is a container. And in fact, the reason for doing this is that we know that container has some properties, Window has all the properties container does, but it also has more specific things that it does. A frame has all the properties that window has, and it has more specific things. So as we move down this list, we're getting more and more specific, right? If we think about it as the rectangle, well, to be a rectangle, you have to have right angles and you have to have four sides, right angles for all four sides, and then you're a rectangle. A square is a more specific version of a rectangle, right? So every square is a rectangle. Square would be lower on our hierarchy list. It is the same requirements as a rectangle, but all the sides also must be the same length. And so now we get more specific. So this is a relationship, right? Every square is a rectangle. That means square would be lower on our list, rectangle would be higher. And so if you made a square class, it might inherit from the rectangle class. It might be able to do everything a rectangle class does plus more, or maybe a little differently. But that relationship, as we define classes and represent more complex relationships, is useful. So these are a little bit high level, maybe not, maybe seeing their purpose doesn't end up coming out clearly. But when it comes to examples like square and rectangle, we can start seeing the relationships a little more clearly. Now, the frame, the window, the container, all these are important and useful in Java. They let us help draw. They're really used in drawing, graphics, showing things like the whole window here. And then, frames in the window or a container in general holds stuff. The container might hold a window, and the window might have frames in it, or might have a frame. But every frame is a window. Every window is a container. And so all these relationships are defined and controlled by this inheritance idea. And so that's the general idea about inheritance. And so hopefully, once we realize that, if we scroll back up, we know that a frame is a container. It has all the information a container would have plus more. Every window is a container. It has all the information a container would have plus more. And so when we have a method that tries to print a container, it can print a frame and a window because a frame is a container. A window is a container. And when we try to hold containers in an array list, we can also hold frames and windows because frames and windows are also containers. And when we try to print them and save them in variables, well, a variable that points to a container can point to a frame or a window, because everything that we would need to do with a container variable, we can do with a frame or window variable, because frames and windows are containers. Now, this would not work if we flipped it. If we tried to, for example, take a method that took in a frame and pass in a container, it would not work, right? So if we had a method that was specific to a square and we tried to pass in a rectangle, it may not work. Same idea here. And so as we go through and describe these relationships, you'll have a better understanding about how this works, and we'll see what that actually means when it comes to code. So I'll see you guys next time for a little more practical examples when we dive into the person and the Phoenix cardholder class.